My name is Daniel. I am an Israelite. I come from a well-respected family who taught me to honor the Lord God. Unfortunately, the kings and priests of Israel have turned their backs on God and done evil in His sight. Nothing has gone well since. The Babylonians have invaded our country and turned our lives upside down. They have destroyed our homes and our land. God's temple has been burned to the ground. Our people have been taken captive to Babylon by the ruthless king Nebuchadnezzar. He has torn us from our families. Even my name has been changed. I have nothing left. My home is now a place I can only dream about. I am stuck in a strange and terrible land where I will probably spend the rest of my life. Without God, I would lose all hope.
Good morning, everyone. So good to have you here today on all three of our Parker Hill campuses, Clark Summit, Wilkes-Barre, and Dixon City, on this Independence Day weekend. And you know, we are incredibly blessed to live in a nation where we have such freedom and so much prosperity. And I just believe that one of the best ways that we can show our gratitude for the freedom that we enjoy is to help other people experience freedom. And so let me encourage you one more time to participate in this project that you heard about a few minutes ago. It's called Songs for Freedom. We're partnering with the Restovic Freedom Foundation to help end child slavery in the country of Haiti. And I've got an envelope with me today because my family and I this weekend are going to be jumping in. We're excited to be able to give freedom to some kids who may only dream about it. And we'd love to see everybody on board with this so we can raise the money that we need to make this happen in the part of the country that we're responsible for with our partnership in Malheuret. So take advantage of that envelope or go online, jump in with us for Songs for Freedom. Well, today we are bringing this series in for a landing, this series called When in Babylon. And I'll tell you what, I've really enjoyed this series. I've really enjoyed learning some incredible things from the life of Daniel, and I hope that you have too. And today as we end this series, I just want to talk about what it looks like for us as followers of Christ to live out our faith in a culture that is sometimes apathetic toward or even antagonistic toward spiritual truth. In other words, how do we live as the people of God in our own Babylon? And I love the story of Daniel because it tells us how to do this. And today, as we think about this subject, I want to put a couple of images up here on the screens for you and ask you to think about these, because these two objects are very similar in many ways. They're both white. They both have numbers. They both have dials. And so they're very similar, and yet they are also very, very different. Because this one on the right-hand side, this is a thermometer, and this one on the other side is a thermostat. And what a thermometer does is it reflects the temperature of its environment. But what a thermostat does is it changes the temperature of its environment. And I've come to the conclusion that when it comes to following Christ, there are basically two kinds of Christians. There are Christians who are kind of like a thermometer. In other words, they just kind of reflect the spiritual environment that they happen to be in. They just mirror what's happening around them. But then there are other Christians who are more like a thermostat. They change whatever environment they happen to be in. They raise the spiritual temperature within their sphere of influence. So here's my question for you today. My question is, what kind of Christian are you? Are you more like a thermometer that you just kind of adapt to whatever environment that you're in? Are you more like a thermostat where wherever you go, you raise the spiritual temperature in your family, in your neighborhood, in your place of work, wherever it is you go to school? See, here's what I believe. I believe that deep down inside, every single one of us wants to make a difference in this world. Every single one of us, I think, wants to be a positive influence in our culture. We want to be known as people who make a positive difference in this world, especially if you're a follower of Christ. I think that's true. I think we all want that deep down inside. We want to be more like a thermostat than a thermometer. But here's the question. How do you do that? How do you do that well? How do you do that wisely in this culture in which we live? And this is what I love about the story of Daniel. The story of Daniel just teaches us in a very, very powerful way how to live out our faith in our own Babylon. So let me just do a little bit of background for those of you who are hearing this message series for the first time, or a little bit of review if you've been here. Just remember, Daniel was Jewish, and as a teenager, the Babylonian army came in and they attacked his city, Jerusalem, and destroyed the city. And then Daniel, as a young man, maybe 15 years old, along with others, was taken captive. And so he was torn away from everything that was familiar to him, his family and his home and his culture. And he was taken 500 miles away to Babylon. And so he went from living in a monotheistic God of the Bible culture to living in a pagan culture, a culture that was hostile to everything that he believed in. And yet in that culture, in Babylon, Daniel not only survived, he thrived, and he had an incredibly positive influence there. So today, I'd like you to turn to Daniel chapter 6 with me if you have a Bible, or bring that up on a Bible app, or if you want to, just follow on the screens as I walk through Daniel chapter 6. You also have a connection card that you received when you came in. Great spot there to take some notes on the back of that. We always encourage that. And let me give you something to write down right up front, because I think this is the big lesson. This is the big takeaway from the entire story of Daniel, not just chapter 6. And it's this, that God works through people who don't pull away, blend in, or lash out. And I stated this way, I stated this negatively, because I think these are the three things that we tend to do when it comes to relating to our culture and being thermostats instead of thermometers, or being one or the other. We tend sometimes to pull away, to isolate ourselves and separate ourselves from this world because we're afraid of its influence. Or on the other hand, what we sometimes do is we blend in. We just kind of reshape our morality and reshape our values to fit wherever we happen to be. Or sometimes what we do is we lash out. We just get angry and we get frustrated at things happening in our culture, and we lash out. But listen, God works through people who don't pull away, who don't blend in, and who don't lash out. Or let me just take it a step further, and I would say this, that this world needs people who don't pull away, blend in, or lash out. And I would say our nation, as we think about our past and our future, our nation needs people like this. In fact, northeastern Pennsylvania needs people like this. And this is exactly what we see Daniel, this guy whose life we've been talking about, this is what we see him model, and we see it so incredibly powerfully modeled for us here in Daniel chapter 6. So let me tell you what's happening at this point. Daniel chapter 6, by this point, Daniel is an old man. He's probably in his early 80s. The Babylonian Empire is no longer, it has fallen, and so the Medo-Persian Empire is now large and in charge, and the new king in Babylon is a guy by the name of Darius. And so he goes about setting up this empire, this kingdom that he is now in charge of. And here's what happens, verse 1. It pleased Darius to appoint 120 satraps, or think of the word governors, to rule throughout the kingdom, with 3 administrators over them, one of whom was Daniel. The satraps were made accountable to them so that the king might not suffer loss. And so this is describing really the organizational chart, the organizational system of the empire. So there were 120 satraps that were ruling, and he divided up the land and the territories between them. And then there were 3 administrators that oversaw those 120 governors or satraps, one of whom was Daniel. Now, Daniel was really a good choice for this, if you think about it, because he had lived in Babylon for decades. He knew the people, he knew the history, he knew the culture of that part of the world, and yet at the same time, he wasn't loyal to the former king. He wasn't loyal to the former empire because he was Jewish. He wasn't Babylonian. And so he was really a good choice to be one of these 3 administrators. In fact, he turned out to be the very best choice of anybody that Darius had chosen to be a leader, because it goes on to say this in verse 3. Now Daniel so distinguished himself among the administrators and the satraps by his exceptional qualities. In other words, his integrity, his dependability, his work ethic, his attitude. He so distinguished himself that the king planned to set him over the whole kingdom. In other words, the king was planning to turn the entire operation over to Daniel because he saw so much potential in him. Now, I want to stop right here. And before we move on with the story, I just want to point out something to you. I want to point out the fact that even though Daniel was in a very foreign culture here in Babylon, he didn't pull away from his culture. He engaged in his culture. I mean, he's got this incredibly powerful position within the government, and he's working hard. He's doing his best. He's moving up. And think about this. He is contributing to the success of a pagan empire. I mean, Daniel was incredibly engaged in his culture. And I mention this because what we so often tend to do as Christians in the United States today is we tend sometimes to pull away from our culture. And we tend to pull back into a little Christian subculture where we have our own relationships and our own language and our own stuff going on. If you are my age, you might remember back in the 70s the story about a little boy named David Vedder. David was born with severe combined immunodeficiency. In other words, he had literally no immune system. And back when he was born in 1971, there was no medical treatment for this condition. And so kids born with this condition would die actually within several weeks. And so what his parents decided to do and what his doctors decided to do was to try to keep him alive by placing him inside of a sterile plastic bubble that actually had been built by NASA. And so they did that, and he lived within this environment, and for his entire life, he never physically touched another human being. But even in spite of all of those precautions, eventually at the age of 12, tragically, he contracted an infection, and he passed away. And, you know, when I think about the tragic story of David Vedder, I thought to myself, you know, that's a picture of the way that we live sometimes in the church, where we put ourselves inside of this relational and spiritual bubble, and we keep the world away from us because we're afraid of the influence of this world, and we just kind of huddle down and hunker down into our little Christian subculture, and we lob our verbal grenades at the people that we don't like or the ideas that we disagree with. And listen, Daniel didn't do that. He didn't pull away. He was fully engaged in the culture in which he found himself. Okay, so let's keep reading the story. Here's what happens next. The king is about to put him in charge of the whole deal. And the other administrators, they are not happy about this. They're jealous because, number one, they want the position. And number two, Daniel isn't even one of them. He's an outsider. He's Jewish. So at this, finding this out, the administrators and the satraps tried to find grounds for charges against Daniel in his conduct of government affairs. So imagine this. Imagine you've got 122 very powerful people digging into every corner of your life, trying to find some dirt they can use against you, trying to find any skeleton in your closet. That's what's happening to Daniel here. But amazingly enough, they find nothing, because it goes on to say this: they could find no corruption in him because he was trustworthy and neither corrupt nor negligent. I mean, that is amazing. You know, he had been in public service for decades at this point in his life, but, you know, no bribes, no kickbacks, no scandals, just this decades-long record of hard work and good leadership. And, you know, I read this and like, man, this is so convicting, because I think to myself, what if somebody were to look at my life that closely? Would this be their conclusion as well? I mean, think about it. What if somebody were to go through your phone records and your internet, habits, and to go through your tax returns? Would that make you a little bit nervous? I know it would me. But Daniel, he just lived this incredible life of integrity. I love what Will Rogers said at one time. He said this, he said, live in such a way that you wouldn't be afraid to sell the family parrot to the town gossip. I love that. And that's the way that Daniel lived. He didn't let success keep him from being a man of integrity. So, as they investigate his background, his enemies, they don't find anything to use against him per se, but what they do discover is this, that his faith was really the driving force of his life. They discover that for Daniel, his faith in God, that wasn't just a 1 hour on Sunday kind of a thing. It was a defining reality of his life. And so they decide to use that against him. Here's what it says, verse 5. Finally, it says, these men said, we will never find any basis for charges against this man Daniel unless it has something to do with the law of his God. And I read that, and again, that's like so convicting. And I wonder if people could ever say that about me, that my relationship with God is so strong and my faith is so consistent that it's the one thing they, know that they could use against me. Man, I don't know. But that's what these guys do. So it goes on to say this, verse 6. So these administrators and satraps went as a group to the king and said, may King Darius live forever. The royal administrators, prefects, satraps, advisors, and governors have all agreed. Not really, because Daniel was never in on the meeting, but they say, we've all agreed that the king should issue an edict and enforce the decree that anyone who prays to any god or human being during the next 30 days, except to you, your majesty, shall be thrown into the lion's den. Do you see what they're doing? They're approaching him by way of his ego. I mean, they're using flattery, one of the most powerful weapons there is. And, they're saying, listen, we got an idea, king. You've heard of the wine of the month? We're going to make you the god of the month. Isn't that a great idea? And so here's what it goes on to say. Verse 8, now your majesty, issue the decree and put it in writing so that it cannot be altered in accordance with the law of the Medes and Persians, which cannot be repealed, because the Medes and the Persians, the Medo-Persian Empire, they had this custom where if a king passed a law, he couldn't repeal it. A future king could, but he couldn't. And the idea behind that was that it would make the king think really long and hard before making any kind of a new law, that he wouldn't make a new law just on a whim. I mean, that was the idea behind it. Didn't work very well in this case, because Darius is so caught up, so swept away by the flattery. It just says, so King Darius put the decree in writing. Now, Daniel comes to a decision moment. Listen to how verse 10 begins. It begins this way. Now, when Daniel learned that the decree had been published, what do you do in this moment? I would suggest to you that this would be the moment, if there were ever a moment in your life when you would just try to blend in, to just try to not stand out, to try to keep your head down, stay off the radar, right? And think about how you could rationalize this. Daniel, he's about to be promoted to the most powerful position in the empire. And he could say to himself, you know what? If I get this promotion, I'm going to have so much influence, and I could use that influence for God. But you know what? I can't influence anybody if I'm dead. And besides, I'm not going to quit praying altogether. We'll just call this like a 30-day prayer sabbatical, and then we'll go right back to it. Or, he could have said, you know what, I think I can pray silently with my eyes open, while I'm walking around. It would have been so easy to rationalize this and just not draw attention to yourself and just kind of blend in. And I wonder how any of us would have responded to this law. I learned a new word recently. It's the word flexitarian. Do you know what a flexitarian is? There was an article on MSNBC on their website a couple of years back called Are You a Flexitarian? And a flexitarian is this. A flexitarian is someone who likes the idea of being a vegetarian, but who also really likes meat. So you're a vegetarian, but you're flexible on it, so you're called a flexitarian. And in the article, they interviewed a 28-year-old young woman by the name of Christine who said, I usually eat vegetarian, but I really like sausage too. I want to be a vegetarian, but I'm just not 100% committed. And I read that and I thought to myself, you know what? That's the way I think a lot of Christians live out their faith. They're kind of a flexitarian. I love Jesus, but I'm just not 100% committed. And so when the pressure's on and when it's going to cost something, we just kind of reshape our morality, we reshape our values and our faith, and we just try to blend in. But listen, Daniel doesn't do that. Let me go back to verse 10. Here's what it says. Now when Daniel learned that the decree had been published, he went home to his upstairs room where the windows open toward Jerusalem. There's a great reason for that. Don't have time to explain it. And 3 times a day, he got down on his knees and prayed, giving thanks to his God. And listen to this, just as he had done before. Very important phrase right there. Very important phrase, because here's what didn't happen. Daniel didn't suddenly start praying as a form of protest. Daniel didn't say, oh, you know what, the government's trying to infringe on my rights to pray, and so I'm going to pray 3 times a day just to make a point. This was not a reaction. This was a habit of his life, and so he just did as he had always done before. And I think that one phrase, I think, explains the entire book of Daniel. I think it explains Daniel's whole story. This is a key to understanding why Daniel was able to maintain such a strong faith even in a culture that opposed everything that he stood for. See, he was able to stay strong because Daniel was dialed into the heart of God, and 3 times a day he set everything else aside so that he could reconnect with his heavenly Father. Because Daniel knew that the only way he was ever going to stay on track in that culture is if he would constantly recalibrate his heart and constantly reconnect with truth and reconnect with God for the next step that he would have to take. I mean, I think this explains why he could be in that culture and yet not be seduced by that culture. And by the way, this is why we encourage you to do things like make it a habit to be in church every week so you can be with God's people and hear God's truth and recalibrate your heart. This is why we encourage you to become part of a small group so you can be surrounded by other believers who will encourage you in your walk. This is why we encourage you to read the Bible on your own, to keep learning and growing outside of church. Because the only way, I think, we can be truly engaged in our culture without being seduced by the messages of our culture is to stay connected to the heart of God. So Daniel's amazing. He doesn't pull back, fully engaged in his culture. When the moment of truth comes, he doesn't blend in. He stands out, and we sometimes just blend in. And you know what happens when we do that, when we just blend in? That's when we become salt that has no flavor, and that's when this culture loses the precious influence of God's people. So Daniel doesn't blend in. Let me pick up the story. Here's what happens next, verse 11. Then these men went as a group and found Daniel praying and asking God for help. They knew his routine. They knew his faith. And so they went to the king and spoke to him about his royal decree. Did you not publish a decree? I mean, we're trying to remember. We think there was one, but we kind of forgot, so we had to check back in. Did you not publish a decree that during the next 30 days, anyone who prays to any god or human being except you, your majesty, would be thrown into the lion's den? The king answered, the decree stands in accordance with the law of the Medes and the Persians, which cannot be repealed. And so they bait the hook, and he takes the bait, and the hook is set. And then they go on to say this. Then they said to the king, Daniel, who is one of the exiles from Judah, do you hear the racism in that? Do you hear the prejudice in that? Daniel pays no attention to you, your majesty, or to the decree that you put in writing. He still prays 3 times a day, and immediately the king realizes that he has been played like a violin. And here's what happens, verse 14. When the king heard this, he was greatly distressed. He was greatly distressed. He was determined to rescue Daniel and made every effort until sundown to save him. Now, you read that, and it makes you realize that Daniel had earned a deep level of respect from this pagan king. That Daniel had built a friendship with Darius. That Daniel had been such a blessing in the life of Darius that when Darius realizes what he had done, he scrambles. He spends the entire afternoon looking for loopholes, calling the lawyers, trying to get it straightened out, trying to stop this thing. Because Daniel had had that much of an impact in a fairly brief time on the heart of this king. But then the other guys get wind of this. Verse 15. Then the men went as a group to King Darius and said to him, remember, your majesty, and we're watching you, remember that according to the law of the Medes and Persians, no decree or edict that the king issues can be changed. And the king realizes now he's got no choice. So the king gave the order, and they brought Daniel and threw him into the lion's den. The king said to Daniel, may your God whom you serve continually rescue you. A stone was brought and placed over the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet ring and with the rings of his nobles, so that Daniel's situation might not be changed. Now, Let me tell you something. If the story ended right there, man, it would still be a great story. And here's a man, Daniel, who stands out in his culture, who doesn't blend in, who's engaged in his culture, comes to the moment of truth. He's faithful to God. He's put to death for it. He steps into eternity. He's greeted by his heavenly Father who says, well done, good and faithful servant. I mean, if it ended right there, it'd still be a great story. But if you've grown up in church, and maybe you haven't even been in church, but you know probably that's not the end of the story. It has a whole different ending. But here's the thing. We know that. But Daniel didn't know that, right? He had no idea what would happen to him when he got dropped into that lion's den. As far as he knew, that was the end of the road for him. And I thought to myself, you know what? It would have been so much easier on Daniel if God could have kind of appeared to him in a dream or something and said, Daniel, let me tell you what's going to happen, okay? Daniel, if you defy the proclamation of the king, you're going to get thrown into a lion's den, okay? But don't worry, because I'm going to send an angel. It's going to shut the mouths of the lions, and you're going to come out alive. And Daniel, your story is going to be told in the Bible. And I know you don't even know what the Bible is, but trust me, it's going to be huge. And Daniel, people are going to know your name, and parents are going to name their kids after you. So don't worry, Daniel. It's going to be fine. Daniel didn't know that. He didn't know any of that. All he knew was this. He knew that God was worthy of his trust. And God was worthy of his faithfulness. And if he would just trust and if he would just be faithful, then God would use his trust and his faithfulness somehow for his glory. And Daniel knew that. And the problem is that sometimes we face an opportunity to live according to our faith and our values, and we're tempted to blend in. And we come to that crossroads, and fear sometimes begins to rise up within us. And our fear of the consequences, our fear of what other people may think, our fear becomes bigger than our trust in God. And we don't know how the story is always going to turn out, but we know that God is worthy of our trust. And we have to trust more than we fear. Trusting that maybe we won't even see it in this life, but eventually God will use our faithfulness for something good in this world. But see, in Daniel's story, he got to see it. He got to see the outcome. Here's the rest of the story, verse 19. At the first light of dawn, the king got up and hurried to the lion's den. When he came near the den, he called to Daniel in an anguished voice, because he really cares about this guy. He says, Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to rescue you from the lions? Now listen, if that's me, I'm going to pause a minute or two. I'm going to make this guy sweat, But not Daniel. He answers right away, verse 21. Daniel answered, O king, live forever. Can I be honest with you? That's not what I would have said, okay? Those would not be the first words out of my mouth. I think I would have said, O king, what were you thinking? Or, O king, come on down here, there's someone I would like you to pet. And Daniel just says, O king, live forever. I mean, he shows grace to a guy who tried to kill him. He shows grace to a guy who didn't deserve it. You know what Daniel didn't do? Here's what Daniel didn't do. He didn't lash out. Can I be honest about one of my observations about Christianity and our culture? One of my observations is this, that we just don't suffer well. We really don't. We face the slightest affront to our faith, whether it's a court decision or a law that gets passed or just somebody's opinion that we hear about in the news. We face the slightest, not even persecution. I would call it just inconvenience or insult. And we lash out. We blast out these Facebook diatribes, or we stand back and lob these verbal grenades at the people or the groups or the ideas that we don't like. And you know what we do when we do that? We reinforce a perception about Christians in our culture. And by the way, a perception that is becoming very, very common. And the perception is this, that Christians are judgmental, that Christians are unloving, that Christians are hypercritical. And every time we lash out at our culture, instead of showing grace, that's the perception we reinforce. And it's a very common perception. I'll give you an example. This is from the TV show The Simpsons, which, by the way, is the longest running TV show ever, which tells us something about our culture, but that's another message. But in The Simpsons, the next door neighbors of Marge and Homer Simpsons are these guys, Ned and Maude Flanders. And in the TV show, they are portrayed as Christians, as, serious, devout Christians. In fact, if you were to ask the average college student today to name a famous Christian family, the number one answer is Ned and Maude Flanders. Now, if you ever watch The Simpsons, and I'm not recommending that you do, but if you ever watch the show, it's very, very interesting to watch how this family is portrayed, because it tells us something about how Christians are being perceived in our culture. I'll give you an example. There's one episode where Homer Simpson sees Maude Flanders across the fence, and he says to her, "Hey, haven't seen you in a couple of weeks. Where have you been?" And Maude responds by saying this. She says, "Oh, I've been away at Bible camp, learning to be more judgmental." And let me tell you something. Every time we lash out at our culture, we just reinforce that perception. And I love the story of Daniel. I love the life of Daniel because, listen, this is a guy who doesn't pull back. He doesn't blend in. And when the time comes, he doesn't lash out. Here's how the story continues. Back to verse 21. Daniel answered, "O king, live forever. My God sent his angel, and he shut the mouths of the lions. They have not hurt me because I was found innocent in his sight, nor have I ever done any wrong before you, O king." The king was overjoyed and gave orders to lift Daniel out of the den. And when Daniel was lifted from the den, no wound was found on him because he had trusted in his God. By the way, do you know why the lions didn't eat Daniel? I just came across this in my research this week. Do you know why they didn't eat Daniel? Because they knew that Daniel was a good man. And so they didn't even bother to try to eat him because they know you can't keep a good man down. Okay, y'all are going to quote that. I know that you are. Okay, here's how the story ends, verse 25. Then King Darius wrote to all the nations and peoples of every language in all the earth, "May you prosper greatly. I issue a decree that in every part of my kingdom people must fear and reverence the God of Daniel, for he is the living God, and he endures forever. His kingdom will not be destroyed. His dominion will never end. He rescues and he saves. He performs signs and wonders in the heavens and on the earth. He has rescued Daniel from the power of the lions." So Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus the Persian. So because of his faith and because of his character and because he was a man who didn't pull back or blend in or lash out, Daniel's life had an incredible impact literally on the entire world in which we live, in which he lived. Let me tell you something. I think the world needs people like this. Our nation needs people like this. Northeastern Pennsylvania needs people just like Daniel, people who won't pull away, people who won't blend in, people who won't lash out. And listen, if we can be people like that, if we can be a church like that, I believe we'll see thousands of people drawn to the heart of Christ who cross the line of faith. I really, really believe that. I want to end this message in this series with a story that comes from a book entitled "Of Whom the World Was Not Worthy," written by Marie Chapin. And the book is the true story of a pastor and his family who lived in the country of Yugoslavia during World War II. And during World War II, the country of Yugoslavia had been overrun and just ravaged by the Nazis. And in the story, there's an older man who lives in this village. His name is Zimmerman. And Zimmerman lived in the same small village as this young pastor by the name of Jakob. And Zimmerman was bitter and he was angry toward the church because he felt like the church hadn't done enough to protect his family from the Nazis. And so Jakob came to him one day and started to tell him about Christ. And this is what Zimmerman says. He says, "Don't talk to me about Christ." He said, "You see those priests there with all their vestments, all their cloaks, all the big crosses on their chests?" He says, "I know that what they are really like." He says, "Don't tell me about Christ." And Jakob, this young pastor, tries to convince him that it would really be unwise to make a decision about Christ based on those who claim to represent him, who wear his name, who wear his garments. And then he goes on to say this. He says, Zimmerman, can I ask you a question? What if I stole your coat and your boots, put them on, broke into a bank, and took the money? I was chased by the police, but I outran them. What would you say if the police came knocking on your door and charged you with breaking into a bank because they saw your coat? Do you see his point? He's saying just because somebody wears the garments of a priest, or somebody names the name of Christ, or they say they speak on his behalf, doesn't mean they're acting as he would act just because they saw your coat. And Zimmerman, in response, he says this. He says, Jakob, just leave me alone. I know what you're driving at. I don't want to get into this discussion. And so Jakob left, but he would come back every few months and he would just encourage his friend and pray for his friend and love his friend. And then one day Zimmerman gets down on his knees. He surrenders his heart to Christ, becomes a believer, and he gets up and he wipes the tears away from his eyes. And then he says this to this young pastor. He says, Jakob, thank you for being in my life. He said, you wear his coat very well. And this is my prayer for us as a church. This is my prayer for every single one of us who are followers of Christ, that we would simply wear his coat very well. And as we wrap up this message and as we wrap up this series, we're going to have the band come back up and we're going to close with one more song. And it's a song that reminds us that of all the leaders that have risen and fallen in history, and of all of the kingdoms that have risen and fallen in history, there is one king who is the King of Kings, and there is one kingdom that will last forever. And as I end this message and as we end this series, I just want to read one more time these words from the end of Daniel chapter 6. You won't see them on the screens, just listen as I read them. He is the living God, and he endures forever. His kingdom will not be destroyed. His dominion will never end. He rescues and he saves. He performs signs and wonders in the heavens and on the earth.